Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Let's let people get logged in. All right, guys, I say that we start and then let folks catch up. I'm laughing because I'm getting ready to have a cat cross my keyboard, which is what happens here these days. All right, welcome. Good morning, I guess I should say, even though it's good evening for us. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm George Gerchow, I'm Chief Security Officer. I'm joined today by Roland Palmer, our VP of the Global Operations Center, and then Girish, who's VP of absolutely everything when it comes to marketing and a great partner of ours as well, too. We're just going to have an open general conversation about Log4j and the vulnerability itself, some of the things that we've done internally. So it's a pleasure to have you today. We look forward to comments, questions, anything that you may be going through as well, too. And we always want to welcome our customers. And thank you for your loyalty and support of Sumo Logic. Next slide, please. Roland, I'm going to let you do this because we did a session here in the US this morning. I thought you articulated it much better than me. But for sure, this is a big thank you to everyone attending.
Yeah, 100%. And thanks, George. I like this because it's a little bit more intimate than this morning. But essentially to every security professional, customer, partner, interested party out there who works or is continuing to work long hours, and deliver questions, comments, or offers of information. We know, everyone on the call knows it's monotonous and seemingly never ending, but certainly necessary. I just want to extend a heartfelt thank you for everything you're doing, everything you continue to do, from not just other security professionals, but to an entire community who otherwise wouldn't thank you because you have such a thankless job. So again, from myself, on behalf of George, on behalf of Sumo Logic, thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I echo those sentiments as well. Just rewinding the clock a little bit to December 10th. I mean, we've had multiple war rooms. We're working pretty much 24/7 to stay on top of this, even if it's just information, latest news. And so that is definitely very heartfelt, and it's true. One of the big jokes that we have at Sumo Logic all the time, which I always love to pick on our developer friends, even though we're close to them, is developers get to party and security folks get the hangover. So it very much feels like that these days. No offense to anyone, but kind of funny and kind of truthful. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're gonna just go through like some of the facts about it, what we know, how it got here, some of the ways that you can tell if you're impacted or not. We're going to go through our cloud native architecture, why it matters, why we believe that now is the time more than ever to accelerate your journey to the cloud. Incident response, because it's a little bit different. And all of us went through a whole bunch. But when it comes to dealing with cloud service providers like us, some things that you can look out for, obviously AWS as well too, which is where we're currently reside within AWS. We're a multi-tenant platform that was born and bred in AWS. And then what we've done to mitigate the vulnerability, some of the information we know that which is constantly changing and up to date, some resources for you. And this is a key part for those of you who are interested on, some of our response centers, as well as how you can use the product moving forward to help be able to detect and protect against things like this. And then we'll open it up to Q&A, which we're going to do the entire time. I love using the chat. So if you have any questions or comments, let's drop them into the chat as well too. Okay, so some facts and Roland, I think we can move to the next slide. Kind of reminds me of a guy that I know that steals toys from kids, but we're not going to talk about that now. That picture there. Okay, so what is this and what happened and how did it take place? So one of the things I want to mention first while we start getting into the slides is that, I think the open source community is going to take a real big hit here, and I don't know how justified that is. So a lot of this was raised, a while back, that this could be a potential threat by the open source community. It sort of reminds me of, for those of you that have children that are in school, Wikipedia. They always say, don't use Wikipedia. It's not true. And there could be lies in there. Reality is Wikipedia is pretty solid. Why? Because it comes from a self-patrolling type mechanism. Whenever someone puts in something that's false, the community is always looking for accurate updates as well too. But sort of getting back to this vulnerability itself, this JNDI string has been big. And this is what was actually compromised or had the capability to be compromised early on. So Roland, if you can go to the next slide, please. Just a few things to take a look at. So number one, as many of you know by now, and you should know, Log4j is, a open source piece of Apache, which allows for RCE or remote code execution, and it can be exploited by bringing in things from the outside. And we're just, I believe, sort of at the tip or middle of the iceberg on what's happened so far. A lot of this has been around Bitcoin mining that's taken place out there, but Roland will get into more detail around that. But I think some of the biggest takeaways here is that it's very common. So lots of software companies out there, lots of fintech companies. In fact, I would argue that almost every single enterprise company on the planet, small to mid market as well too, is using Log4j in some way, manner, or form. And that last bullet point is absolutely massive. 3 billion devices out there today. Companies like Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, which all of us are very familiar with using this product, Google. So you're not alone, and this is one of the things that I think Roland was making a point of when it came to the thank you, is that none of us are alone, when it comes to figuring out where and how this is being used, and then what the overall risk is, and then a mitigation path moving forward as well too. And so those are some of my thoughts around this. A lot of this, again, where it says, reported in early December, this was reported actually in November that we've seen a lot of evidence of, and it took a certain way to be able to expose this. But Roland, I'd like to get your thoughts on this slide as well too, as we start getting deeper into what it is and what's been exploited so far.
Yeah, thanks again, George. And we had a great question this morning. What types of exploits could happen from, Log4Shell, Log4j. And you nailed it with RCE, remote code execution. It's essentially everything from malware to ransomware, to just, credential harvesting, to PII harvesting. Essentially anything could happen where someone tosses some code on a server or a machine, and now it's theirs essentially to do what they want or do what they would like to do. So probably one of the, next to WannaCry, of course, probably one of the worst things I've seen in my career. And I think that's echoed throughout the community, that this is probably one of the most far-reaching and troublesome vulnerabilities out there.
And we're just really at the beginning of it. Which we've said time and time again. Heartbleed is another one, because I believe Heartbleed was also open source as well too. And so this is just going to continue on. This type of assembly line RCEs, when it comes to what's happening in the development pipeline, is just big. Next slide, please, because we start getting into. Go ahead, Grish, please.
I have a question. You mentioned few brand names as companies who are likely impacted or vulnerable. Is that only the large companies that are potentially exposed vulnerable here, George, or is there a broader lens to say that anyone who's using a web server, that how should people look at this?
I think it's anyone and everyone's probably susceptible to it. The hard part is, how do you know? Most companies, and this is a great question, most companies don't have an updated inventory and asset list, and especially when it comes to open source. Open source is something that almost every single developer I know on the planet is going to use and going to leverage. And it's hard to monitor in a lot of ways, because it's part of what they use for their assemblies, which we're going to talk about in a bit. CI/CD pipeline, software development lifecycle, call it what you want, depending on what stage you are when it comes to app modernization. But it's hard to detect exactly where it's at. And that's what makes this one so interesting. And it does with open source, is a lot of times you have a lot of regulation in your company and checks and balances when it comes to what people are using. Like you have gates in finance, like we're not going to approve anything that's not on an approved list. We're going to add it to inventory. But when it comes to open source, and Roland and the Global Operations Center deal with this on a daily basis, it's a little bit harder to figure out where it is. So back to kind of the point of your question, we think it's anyone and everyone. It's just good to use the larger examples of companies, because again, you're not alone. If Microsoft and Amazon are struggling with this, if Apple's struggling with it, chances are you are too. And so it's always good to know that these behemoths and giants are dealing with this as well. But the smaller companies, to your point, they're also dealing with it. So everyone kind of is. Roland, I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback off of what you said. Not only from the giants in the tech community to fintech, all the way down to your local mom and pop store using a point of sale system that leverages Log4j in their application stack. But that goes all the way down to the normal user, to me, you, Garish, everyone on the call who has a laptop or interacts with any software platform or application on the internet. We're all potentially impacted because we may have missed an upgrade that's local to the machine. We may have missed this or missed that. So not just the companies. And of course, that's the easy lens to look at it through, but it's everyone else. So anyone who has access to the internet is potentially vulnerable to this type of exploit.
Yeah, and I got asked that today, like on a personal level, someone was like, God, you seem to be like dealing with this a lot and working all these late nights. And what about the individual user? And that is yet to be determined. How the individual daily user is getting affected by this. And so there's a lot more to go. And I think this slide is just so poignant because, in the beginning, it was like everything that's 2.0 or higher, meaning from about 2.0 to about 2.14. Since then, I mean, we've alone had to do 3 different collector pushes to get people on 2.15. 2.16 last Friday, Saturday, 2.17. And so we're constantly having to keep up with this. And it seems like each release, there's a new vulnerability discovered. I think with 2.16, it was DOS. And so it's just going to be one of those things where it's not going to stop. It's not going to stop anytime soon. Something else that I predicted as well too is, I believe if you look at this, it seems to be Fridays, the days that have been pretty hairy, right? Like December 10th. And then all of a sudden it was December 17th. Well, guess what next Friday is? Next Friday is Christmas Eve. And so I expect something big to happen on Christmas Eve. Bad actors don't care. When there's times of high anxiety or times where most people should be feeling good about what's going on, that is when they're going to strike the most. And so just continue to pay close attention. If you're a Sumo Logic customer, continue to work with us. We're going to give you some resources here shortly, but again, this isn't going to go away anytime soon. Next slide, please. So this is something that, again, kind of going back, the software flaw was reported by the community, volunteer coders back in November. And, they really wanted to start talking about this a little bit more openly. And I'm not sure why, a lot of people didn't heed their advice when they said that this could potentially turn into something big. But of course, being in security is like selling insurance. You're constantly talking about the what ifs, what could happen and everything else. So it really wasn't until early December when an RCE really started taking place against Minecraft servers, and Minecraft being one of the most popular games out there today. And again, it's one of the things I love about this game is it's really development focused. For any of you that have played before, that's when it really started taking place. That's when folks really started paying attention. And then, the internet exploded on the next Friday. And so it's one of those things, I think that now, 2 things that we can take away from this in this slide here is one, here in the US, our government is starting to look at what's called an SBOM, or software bill of materials, which is what's the recipe behind the sausage that's being made when it comes to code delivery. I think this is going to be a really big thing worldwide here soon. The second thing is like, let's not wait until it really hits, something to start paying attention to it and start looking at our supply chain and what's taken place. So when this all came out in early November, me included, we should have paid a little bit more attention to it and realized the potential in it. I think the open source community did the best they could to give a warning out there, and we should have probably paid a little bit more attention. But that's neither here nor there. We are where we are today. And so now what we got to do is take the information we have and continue to move forward and be transparent and collaborate a bit more as security professionals. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's start getting a little bit more into, are you impacted, some of the things you can do, and then again, starting to talk about some of the cloud native architecture, what that means, and then how we move forward. Next slide, please. All right, so the biggest thing is if you are using it anywhere, absolutely anywhere in your environment, you could be vulnerable to attacks. Luckily enough for us so far, and again, I'm going to knock on wood, because of the way that we were using it internally and externally, we believe that the risk was minimal and we haven't been exploited yet. But again, I mean, look, this is always sort of the issue with communication is you can sometimes over rotate and say, we haven't been exploited, the impact has been minimal, and then boom, it can happen at any given day. And which, by the way, if it does happen to us, you'll know. We're going to come out and be very transparent about it, by the nature of who we are as a company, all the regulations that we're under. We're also a public facing company. It's our duty to expose that to our user community. And so just keep this in mind. If you have it, you could be vulnerable today and you could be exploited at some point in time. Next slide, please.
So George, before you move off that,
sure.
There are 4 different words I'm hearing: vulnerable, exploited, impacted, affected. Can you clarify, is there a hierarchy that our audience needs to think through? It's because when I think about impacted, I'm like, oh my God, I need to go do something right now. Vulnerable is, okay, maybe I'm weak, all right? My systems are weak. So perhaps Roland and you can give a lens from your perspective. What do these teams specifically mean from a guidance perspective?
Sure, and because I did one this morning, go ahead and take this one over from your perspective, since you run the Global Operations Center.
Awesome. So when we say impacted, I'm gonna walk out on a limb here and say everyone on this call was impacted, and here's how I define it. Here's how I like to think about it. If you're working long hours to look into what's happening in your environment, if you're somehow having to change the way you operate inside your business as you think through Log4j, if you have to do something in preparation for what could potentially happen, you were impacted. You're forced to do something because Log4j existed. When we start talking about vulnerable or susceptible, if you will, we're saying that given the current situation and your current version of Log4j, it is, or any vulnerability for that matter, it is possible for a bad actor to take advantage of that vulnerability or that issue. And that's a great point, George. Always a possibility, that vulnerability, and go to the next level of exploit. And that exploit, some action happened, right? Because so vulnerability is kind of the stasis of it's possible to happen, that exploited or compromised and action happened. That means they either harvested credentials, you all of a sudden have some big or some mining going on in your environment, some C2 going on in your environment, those type of things. So from impacted to, hey, does it change the way you operate? Did you have to do something in preparation for it or as a result of? To vulnerable, the possibility of something happening, to vulnerable being the possibility of, all the way to compromise or exploit it, that thing actually happened. That's how we're defining those words.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question, Girish, and I dropped a few things in there as well too. I mean, this is about risk. Ultimately, that's what you want to get to. It was disruptive. It's going to be disruptive. The amount of war rooms we've had, the cross-functional things that we've had to go through, incident response, everything else, communication, it's disrupted our company. But without a doubt, we keep on leaning into what is the risk, and that's what everyone out there should do today. We fully recommend patching and everything else as well, but you also got to have your appetite for risk tolerance and be able to measure that within an organization, which isn't easy, which is a great setup for what we're going to talk about now. Because we were cloud native, thank you. Because we were cloud native, we believe that the risk was minimal for a few things. Number one, the way that we responded. So having a global operations center, which for those of you who are like, what is a global operations center? Look at it as a combination of a NOC and a SOC, a centralized way to be able to communicate and gather information across the organization and then react to the possible threats that are taking place. We believe that to be more efficient in the future, these two functions should come together. We're also making bold statements that IT should report, through security, because although availability is everything, availability without seamless security is nothing, as we've seen throughout these supply chain attacks. And one of the reasons why I go into this graphic here is we're all in this DevOps mentality now where we're building workloads, but we're doing the operational aspects behind it as we're deploying those workloads. And then we're in this continuous delivery model, which, again, thanks to Sumo, because we have this constant release cycle taking place, we're able to update things pretty quickly for our customers. And a big shout out to our collector team who's done 3 updates over the course of the last week and 2 over the course of the last couple of days. And all of this comes down to the fact that, you know, we're in a platform that's built off of microservices. If you stop and think about 3-tiered apps or a waterfall type methodology, it takes months to be able to do releases out there. And I feel for, you know, companies I used to work at, you know, the VMwares of the world, the EMCs of the world, when it came from finance and government contracting, because it's going to take forever for these folks to get patches out, not understanding what versions people are on, not understanding what the infrastructure looks like, applications look like, impact analysis, really difficult. And then finally, another piece as well too is containers. Being able to deploy at mass and in scale, you know, is really a good thing for most organizations, but also an area that needs to be looked into. You know, are these containers being deployed with privileged rights? You know, does Log4j exist within this container type functionality? And so it's a lot to consider and think about when you come from an on-premise type environment. The next bullet point, speed. Speed is everything, you know, so I truly believe that making no decision is the worst decision you can make. You've got to do something. And so taking action is the best thing to do. So we always lean into velocity. And if we make a mistake, and then we're going to reorient and rediscover, you know, and be able to deploy that, you know, across our entire infrastructure because of standardization, which leads me to the multi-tenant bit. Multi-tenancy, people always look at it as having advantage because of scale. And we process, you know, exabytes of data a day, and that's a large amount. But because we are multi-tenant, it means standardization. It means that we have the same releases of Ubuntu across our organization. And yes, there's a cloud service provider, being AWS, that we work with on the shared responsibility model, and they're responsible up to a certain point. And then that's when we're responsible as well too. So that standardization matters top to bottom when it comes to the full observability stack. And then having those rapid updates and being able to respond, I think is what really sets apart, you know, a cloud native company like ours. So I'll take a big pause and I'm gonna hand it back to the man that actually runs the Global Operations Center and get your thoughts around this as well too, because before you joined Sumo years ago, you worked in, you know, a military type environment to where everything was pretty much on-prem.
Yeah, and I'd like to backtrack just a little bit, you know, about what you said towards not making a decision is the worst decision you could make, and folks not forgetting exactly that. Not making a decision is a decision, and again, making that decision to move forward and with the speed is so important. I think in this world, especially when we try to keep up. You mentioned us, you know, our collection team putting out 3 different versions of our collectors. That speed and that decision to execute, I think, was an imperative to service our customers and our partners. So again, much like you said, a huge thanks to our collections team, excuse me. But towards the Global Operations Center and the difference between that, where we exist now, being cloud native, and where I came from, on-prem, huge data center. The way we operated obviously was very different, where the war rooms that you mentioned before, where we're in a video conferencing, would actually exist in the room, where George had to call Roland in, and I'm driving an hour while I'm trying on the phone on my BlackBerry, trying to figure out what's going on, talk to the analysts about what all that's happening. And I'm sure it's matured since I left, but all that was happening. And now to reach anyone, it's just a button click away. That cloud operations, that global operations model, where follow the sun, and we can follow the sun with just a couple clicks of the button. So that cloud native architecture, not just in our platform, but incident response, which I think we're going to talk about next, such an imperative for towards our success inside of what we're troubleshooting today.
Grish, any questions or comments around this?
I do. I thought maybe I heard both of you talk about collectors. I know in our cloud native approach, and actually, it's while we take great pride of being a cloud native solution, we support multi-cloud and hybrid cloud as well, folks. Perhaps Roland or George, you can clarify what we mean by collectors, because we have this concept of hosted collectors and installed collectors, right? Just for the benefit of the audience, so that we don't use terminology that they're not related to. How about clarifying that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, so this is, again, one of the things that I love about leaning into cloud. Installed collectors are something that you have to roll out within your environment. It's not quite an agent. but it's what's used to be able to hit different data sources to bring that information into Sumo Logic and Sumo Logic's cloud. A hosted collector is a wonderful thing because we're almost collectorless in the cloud. And that's a major advantage, So early on when I was with the company, we always talked about this notion of, should we even collect data that's on premise, which by the way, we do. And there's a lot of value in that because we want to support hybrid folks. And as Garish said, we're multi-cloud as well too. But wow, is collecting data totally different in the cloud. And so these installed collectors that we're talking about, and there's two different ways, like right now to upgrade those via CLI, which we'll talk about in a second, or, through the UI itself. I mean, that's really where the pain of this has come into play, has been constantly updating these installed collectors for folks out there today. But again, the way that our collectors work, which we're getting to a slide on this in a second, and Roland, you might as well move to the next slide, is the way that we use Log4j was really to start getting internal information around auditing. So, to date, we have no evidence of being able to bring in something in external as like an RCE to those collectors. But that's a great distinction point, and there's a big piece of me that just wishes everyone had all their data sources in the cloud, or we could do cloud to cloud collections and not have to deal so much with the on-premise stuff. But look, I mean, we're all at different parts in our journey. We were lucky enough to be cloud native from day one. So it's just going to be different for everyone, but that's the difference between the two.
Thank you.
All right, so let's get into some of the details around IR. And this is a whole different world too. And this, I got a big wake up call when I got to Sumo about this too, because I was like, I was so used to, on-premise incident response and just dealing with our team itself. And all of a sudden you have a cloud service provider, so part of all of our customers' incident response has been leveraging Sumo or leveraging, the big infrastructure as a service providers like AWS, GCP, Azure as well too. But really the big things here comes down to these three different bullet points here. And then involving a multitude of people cross-functionally, from SREs, site reliability engineers, to the global operations center that Roland mentioned, customer success, support, and coordinating that is a whole lot of work. And fortunately enough, we're with the gentleman who coordinated a lot of these efforts and his team did. So I'm going to hand it off here to Roland to kind of talk about this. And then some of the things that you implemented way back when it came to Sumo Logic and trying to keep people like me out of that whole stack, even though I constantly try to interject myself. So Roland, take it away.
I just want to start by saying there may be some confusion because of the slide. That's absolutely not Sumo Logic's Global Operations Center. It looks nothing like that. It looks more like this, where there's some folks in a room in a video conference having a conversation and working from either home or maybe in an office, but nothing like that. And I'm happy about that. I'll put it that way. But to the Global Operations Center, George, I just kind of drill into more what you said about IT operations and network operations and security operations. Again, it's that synthesis, right? It is IT operations, NetOps, security operations, but it has a dash of DevSecOps in there as well, and it drives IT and security excellence by leveraging each other, living and operating symbiotically, and using the internal workflows to gain efficiencies to, again, drive that excellence on both sides, both on the IT ops, NetOps side and the security and compliance side of things. So I think it's very important just to call that out. It's that symbiotic relationship, although it should be security owned, it's that IT excellence and security excellence that's driven by that symbiotic relationship. And the Global Operations Center during incident response, it leverages all of those internal capabilities, right? So again, IT ops, NetOps, SecOps, and that splash of DevSecOps to serve as a command and control for incidents. And like George is saying in the chat, we're mobile. We can do this from anywhere. And let's not forget that COVID added another degree of complexity to incident response, in that it's a little bit more difficult to get in the same room with someone. And fortunately for us, we're used to operating in the cloud, and we're used to incident response in the cloud. We're used to that speed of incident response and gathering folks with just a click here, coordinating asynchronously with a sheet, a confined sheet, and updating again asynchronously, follow the sun model. So what does that look like for Log4j? Initially, for Log4j, for this particular vulnerability, it may, like a lot of you out there probably experience, it may seem like chaos. And it wasn't. It's just the Global Operations Center served as a reminder that this is what we do and this is how we do it. This is the main effort. This is how we will be supported. This is who we will be supporting, and roll out the incident response process, that plan that we probably had to dust off, roll out that plan and make sure we execute the right way. And it's something as far reaching as Log4j, something that's really globally impactful. Everyone wants to help, and everyone's driving information into this central organization, that Global Operations Center. And part of the huge responsibility, like George alluded to, is taking that communication and putting it in the right place. That communication was so important, again, from alerting stakeholders internally, alerting stakeholders externally, notifying our customers, and alerting our internal incident response team. That communication was so important and so fast that I think, going back to speed, I think it played such a big part of our success to date. And again, the workflows and coordination, that's one and the same. You know, the communication, workflow communication, communicate the workflows, they're back and forth. And again, the coordination, you're communicating coordination and coordinating communication. So these three things live together, and one can't exist without the other in kind of this cloud incident response model.
Yeah, and one thing I do want to mention too is, like, you know, all of this leads to a post-mortem where you want to get better. And I think one thing we didn't mention this morning that we'll mention now is, I thought it was really cool. Like, we did this really big internal call last Thursday, I believe. Girish, correct me if I'm wrong, but the dates are starting to meld together. And we released a questionnaire afterwards, a survey, just saying, what can we do better? Like, how can we communicate better as an organization? Because we're trying to learn. And unfortunately, the way that we usually learn is when we get to a post-mortem, but we haven't been able to get to one yet because something is surfacing up every single day. And once we get to it, we're going to be really hard on ourselves, work with these different lines of business cross-functionally to just see what could have been done better. And you got to look at yourself honestly, and that's the only way that you're going to get better over time. And so I think, you know, having that kind of transparency and brutal honesty within an organization just makes you better. Next slide. Go ahead, please.
Something else we didn't mention this morning is that with Log4j, the rest of continuous monitoring and everything else that happens from the bad guys and bad folks out there, that doesn't stop. Log4j is just what's bubbled to the top. There's still bad actors out there trying to do bad things to your network, to your platform. And part of the Global Operations Center's responsibility is to continue that continuous monitoring and that incident response and vulnerability management process. And I think that's an important key too, is to make sure you continue to do the work you were doing before Log4j as Log4j is happening. Yeah,
that's a fact too, because you can get caught sleeping. And then all of a sudden something else takes place. You know, like, we had two other things go on when this all first started that Friday. One was the Zoom update and vulnerability that took place, which a lot of you probably dealt with. And then the second one was a small AWS outage as well too. And you got to really be maniacal about cutting through all the noise and getting to the signal when it comes to some of these things. So you're right. That's a really good point we didn't bring up this morning, which is the world doesn't stop. You still got to do your day-to-day job while you're dealing with something like this as well too. Girish, anything else to add before we move on?
No, that's good. I have more questions on the upcoming sections, actually.
Great, thank you. Okay, so how is Sumo Logic mitigating this vulnerability? Let's just get right to the next slide. Something that, you know, we're stealing from our current president of go-to-market, you know, and she's got a huge security background coming from companies like McAfee. From the day she got at Sumo, she said something that I hadn't been able to put into words at that time, and now I'm stealing it all over the place, which is be brilliant at the basics. And so this is what our team has always tried to do, is get out of the way, but just be really good at basic things in time of crisis. And so when you can narrow the scope of focus, you're probably going to do things well. There's always this 80% rule that I like to talk about, you know, when it comes to security and almost anything in life. If you can get 80% there, you've done something pretty good. And then you can try to uplift that to 90, 95%. And then that last bit's always going to be the hard part and the exceptions. And don't focus on that. Focus on the simple things. And so 4 areas of focus for us, and we're going to continue to do this throughout Log4j. Number 1 is our service, our platform. Are we protecting that properly? What is the risk there? What are some of the steps to mitigation that we're taking? And we were really never impacted there because, we had some custom code there that, and you can see it here now, Sumo Log4 layout instead of Log4j, that never invoked custom lookups, meaning that it pretty much killed the possibility of an RCE within our platform. But even though that was the case, we could have sat back and been like, all right, development team, great job, architecture team. Let's just not do anything and we're fine. Nope, we're constantly updating our assemblies as these new releases come out. And assembly, for those of you that are more in the security world and not in development world, those are preset configuration items that you roll out with your workloads. And again, having that cloud native multi-tenant architecture really helped us out here because we know exactly where our assemblies are, we know how they reside, and we know who's responsible for them. So, even though we patched up to 2.15, patched up to 2.16, 2.17, we're not going to let go. We're going to continue to do that again, even though that we believe the risk was minimal and that we were never going to be impacted on our platform. The second step, the collectors we've been talking about, so these installed collectors that are out there now, we believe, because of what I mentioned before, that it was only used for audit logs. We're still going to continue to roll out new collectors and patch those collectors as we have new versions come out, as well as third-party penetration testing, which, by the way, this is bug bounties, and we believe heavily in bug bounties. Better to have ethical hackers come in and try to break stuff within your environment than have a bad actor get in. So we're going through extreme measures to make sure that we're reducing the risk around, or any potential risk around, our collectors, and do due diligence. The third one is the hardest one, I believe, and Roland, I'm going to get your thoughts here in a second. Supply chain is difficult, and I understand why a lot of vendors aren't responding here or have limited response, because you don't want to put your skis ahead of the cart. And this has been a big internal discussion too. People are nervous. Our legal department's nervous. They're like, God, maybe we're talking about this way too much, saying that we're not vulnerable yet and that we haven't been exploited. This is a tricky situation. Because your supply chain and the people that you do business with, like for those of you that have Sumo as a vendor or a trusted partner that you're using, we need to do our due diligence, and we expect that from the rest of our security fabric and our operational fabric. And so we're going back now and looking at our software supply chain, and we've had limited response. We're working really hard. We're understanding. We know what people are going through because we're going through it ourselves. But this is the one area I think it's going to be the hardest for us. And then finally, open source libraries, where we've had the collector deployments in the past and public repositories. So think about this like as Git, GitHub, GitLab. I threw that one in there for you, Roland. Artifactory, through JFrog, Docker Hub. You got to do your due diligence and see where your company's done updates, and make sure that you go back in there and continually update things to be able to mitigate these risks. So I'll take a pause there and then hand it to Roland, see if he has any additional comments, especially around the supply chain, and then like to hear from Girish on any thoughts around this as well too.
Yeah, George, and actually, I want to jump on the 3 new versions released. We had a unique question this morning that asked, when are we going to stop deploying new collectors? And we had a similar question to that on Wednesday of last week, just before 2.17, just before we had the next bad thing happen with Log4j on Friday. And I think as security professionals or practitioners continue to do their job, our bad actor friends, if you will, are going to continue to do theirs. They're going to, as we defend, they're going to get more advanced. We defend, they're going to get more advanced. And as our adversaries outpace us inevitably, they're going to incorporate more advanced vulnerabilities leveraging Log4j, and Sumo Logic is going to attempt to continue to keep up. So you'll continue to see those publishing those, either finding a remedy via code or pumping out another update to our collector. We're going to continue to try to keep up. And I think that's an important note as well. But towards the supply chain, understanding, it's tough to understand, but you have to be understanding, because I don't think I've experienced a situation where all your vendors are potentially impacted. And many of us have many supply chain or many vendors that we have to speak to. And like you mentioned, George, we're all going through practically the same thing. We're trying to discover what happened and if it impacted us. So sometimes we need that correspondence from our supply chain to confirm that, and they're just lagging behind. So we did have a low initial response rate, but we're certainly working on it, and we're driving towards answers as folks begin to learn what happened and how it happened in the right way.
I'll give two shout outs though, two people that responded pretty proactively, AWS and PagerDuty.
PagerDuty, yeah.
Yeah, those were two, and PagerDuty is critical to our IR. And so they were pretty responsive. And I think a lot of times, look, like just lessons learned for any of you out there is say something, do something. Again, this could just be my own philosophy, but I think it's Roland's as well too. We'd rather do something than nothing. And like you said, not making a decision or not taking action is also a decision or an action. And that's just not the way that we're going to operate.
Yeah. So one thing I'm realizing that I was noodling on this earlier in the morning session, guys. There are three perspectives here, because here we are representing our view as internal, our software development firm. We are building commercial software delivered as a cloud model. That's one perspective. And then we are a cloud service provider ourselves, built on top of AWS, secondly. And then the third perspective is more ecosystem perspective, because no company can survive in a complete isolation, doing everything on their own. So I see the perspective, what you're sharing here, Roland and George, in three parts. One as a software provider, one as a cloud service provider, and then more of an ecosystem play from the community approach. I appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, no worries. And it's funny, Girish, because you and I have been talking about this for a long time. When you got to Sumo, remember I was talking about supply chain here and there. We did that webinar with Netscope, remember, with Lamont, at our user conference, Illuminate, and we were talking about this very thing that just happened, which is that ecosystem. And that ecosystem can be scary, like you got to be careful who you partner with. And here's where we can be bold is I've always felt that our platform has been a competitive differentiator because we are cloud native and because of the rigor that we put behind our compliance program and the millions that we invest in that every year. And the fact that now customers don't have to worry about infrastructure, that's gone. And that's a good thing, because right now, if you're using one of our competitors per se, you got to look at that infrastructure. That infrastructure could be different versions of hardware, different vendors that you're dealing with, different versions of Log4j all over the place, depending on how that's constructed. So not only are you looking at the application and the data around this ecosystem, you're also having to deal with that infrastructure. And so I feel for folks, but in a lot of ways, this should also be a forcing function, again, to start looking at more cloud-based solutions. Next slide, please. Okay, so how are we mitigating this vulnerability? So we already took a look at the 4 different maniacal areas of focus we have, but Roland, if you go to the next slide, we can start getting a little bit deeper into this as well too. I think we did, yeah. So some of our published resources that we have out there, so we've been, again, very transparent, up to date, so our collector release notes give you a lot of great information, and you can see the links here as well too, on what latest versions we're at, what we recommend around them, best practices, and on being able to upgrade those as well too. Whether or not, this is a question that comes up all the time as well too, should you use the UI itself, or should you go to the CLI to be able to do that? So we got some guidance there. These last 2 blogs, so actually, why don't you tell us a little bit about these, Girish? Since Roland and I have been doing a lot of talking, you're pretty familiar with these. And thank you for putting that in the chat.
Yeah. I appreciate you putting me on the spot here. So folks, there are a few things here. So there are multiple lenses here. Some of you may be customers, some of you may be partners, some of you may be prospective customers, right? So what you're seeing here is actionable content, irrespective of where you are on your journey. So the collector and the 3 collector updates and how to do things are ones related to how you can upgrade if you're a Sumo customer. What Roland is clicking through is, this is a situational brief published by a special operations team. That's like a can I use the word kick-ass? Okay, kick-ass security
Yes.
team. Not my boss, hopefully doesn't listen to this. So this is a team that we have that actually helps customer hunt for threats and identify their potential vulnerabilities. There are 3 parts to this blog that Roland is walking through. It gives you, irrespective of what kind of Sumo customer you are, whether you're using Sumo for security or you're using Sumo for a security operations function or observability, there is something in it for you. Here you can get started to determine if you are potentially experiencing a Log4j based attack. That's one. And then the second thing is there are some examples here, and we have some additional content in development as well to identify how can you help detect a potential attack as well based on some of our advanced solutions such as CloudSIM Enterprise as well. So the whole point is it's an informational session. If you write up on if you're a customer, if you're using our platform, there are certain activities that you can do to determine if you're potentially experiencing an attack. And the takeaway, folks, is patch now. There is no other way to look at it, right? So that's what George and Roland have done. Even though architecturally we are not vulnerable from this, we have taken the extraordinary step of getting ahead and making sure we upgrade to the right level and patch it. So if there's one thing that you want to hear, I know I'm seeing the thunder here, guys. Patch now if you have not done. Back to you.
That was awesome. Like I mentioned in the chat, you're never caught off guard. You're a true pro with a security background, and I appreciate that. Again, that was pretty deep what Roland was going through, so some queries that we've released out there, obviously with some associated strings. And again, it's drinking our own champagne. Like we used a lot of these over the course of the last 10 days or so, just to check out our own environment and to get a little bit deeper to see where this could possibly be a threat. And some great work also done by the Global Operations Center and some of the folks on Roland's team.
Yeah, so
next slide.
One thing that comes to mind, but I know we provocatively call it infrastructure as a disaster. Here we are not talking about hardware, we are talking about software infrastructure, George.
Look, it really is. It's one of those things now where I just keep thinking that over time, you've got to modernize everything that you're doing, both from a hardware perspective and a software perspective. I'm going to talk about SolarWinds for a second, but there's going to be a couple of things. So one, I have a lot of good friends at SolarWinds. I got a lot of respect for them. And I guarantee you that SolarWinds has got a massive budget now for internal security that they didn't have before all this happened. And we're about a year removed. I've been seeing it pop up on my time hop. But one of the mistakes that people made, I think, when SolarWinds happened was instead of taking a look at areas for improvement and where they should go, they tried replacing SolarWinds with another SolarWinds, which that's just could be a repeatable process for something else to happen. I looked at it as an opportunity, and a lot of my peers in the industry did as well too, to go, all right, how much do I really want to be involved in network security anymore? It was a great opportunity to start saying, maybe this is a time to start moving out to the cloud. Maybe this is a time to reduce that infrastructure. Maybe this is a time, as Girish just mentioned, to start looking at the software infrastructure and who I partner with to take me to that next level. And, so instead of dealing with these same problems over and over again, sometimes we have to change the way that we think and progress a little bit, or else we're going to find ourselves again in the same situation over and over again and start looking at that Albert Einstein quote that many of us have seen and I've been guilty of in the past, of doing the same things over and over again, but expecting a different result. Next slide, please. Okay, so what customers should do now, because again, it's bad, it's getting worse. This is almost a week removed that, that I started putting this together, and we're still in the same situation. And I'm telling you now, hold your breath when Friday comes around, because that seems to be the day. It seems like every Friday is when something else gets exposed. But let's go ahead and start going more to the slides. So it's all about patching. 100% about patching. And for those of you that are customers of ours, stay up to date with our latest releases. What Roland showed you there about the response center as well too, that's always going to have the latest and greatest information out there. But if you're not a customer, what can you do? Well, now's the time to really start looking at solutions like ours and being able to leverage something like that to be able to detect and protect your environment now. Start making those decisions. Start looking at some of the work that Roland's team is doing today, because we're not going to stop. We believe that this thing could have run really, really deep. So we're going to continue our maturization around, again, that detection and protection, leveraging our own product and then our ecosystem, as Girish said, and see where we can get better. And then having some dashboards that make this a little bit easier to be able to recognize instead of going through log searches. So be able to look for those, as we start maturing, moving forward in the next week or so. Roland, Girish, anything you guys want to add to this?
I think so. When we talk about what should customers do, and I think you alluded to it briefly before, outside of everything on this slide, yes, they should absolutely update. They should check out that awareness center that we just showed. But they should also do something like I mentioned, you alluded to, that we're doing kind of a rolling postmortem. And don't attempt to fix this problem, attempt to fix the problem. And I say that to say this. If you do a rolling postmortem, one, you can make improvements. As this inevitably long thing starts to get longer, then you can make continuous improvement. But you can also contribute to whatever happens next. And something bad is going to happen next. Not to be draconian or pessimistic, but one after another, bad folks are going to keep being bad folks. And the rest of us have to keep defending the internet, our companies, our network. We have to continue to do the right thing. So I think having that rolling postmortem, that real-time postmortem, getting that feedback from your constituency to say, hey, how am I doing? What can I do better? What can I do better now? It's also a very integral part of what customers and us, George, like you mentioned, should be and are doing next.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great points, Roland. Let's go to the next slide. I just happened to look at the attending list. And I saw James Paul on there. For a second, I thought it said Jake Paul. I was going to congratulate him on his knockout of Tyrone Woodley, but we don't need to go down that path. Okay, so customer-facing guidance and resources. So you already saw the Log4j Vulnerability Response Center, which again, this thing is getting updated constantly. In fact, I'm so critical of it that yesterday I was guilty on Sunday night here in the US. I was typing to Roland and Chris Ulrich, who's been critical as well too, that runs our audit and compliance team. And I was like, it still says 2.16. By the time I was done putting in that Slack, it had already been updated. And so I need to back off of that a little bit. So it's very much up to date. Again, our situational awareness brief, this is where the meat is. This is where those queries are that I was talking about, those strings. And again, the SpecOps team did a lot of great work. So the Global Operations Center, we had a team out of Japan that started putting stuff together day one, which I love to see that. I love it when our field really gets to work like that and start solving problems for their customers, which they did, because we have a good, size footprint in Japan as well too. So very proud of those folks there. And I want to make sure that we mention that. And then, that resource and response center is just going to be big. So if you are a customer, if you're not a customer, pay attention to that. We're going to have information out there. Again, we're transparent. We're here to help. That's really the big thing that I want you to take away from this slide. Okay, so at this point, let's open up the Q&A. The audience has been pretty quiet so far, but obviously we've done a lot of talking. So let's see if there's any questions out there, anything that folks want to talk about or mention. We welcome that.
I think we answered a lot of the questions that have come in. So I think this is great guidance while we wait for a minute or two to see if there are any new questions that come in, George. I think the key takeaway is patch now. There are resource centers published by us as well as other solution providers to stay ahead of, to improve your cyber defense posture. And I think for me, the takeaway is don't let Log4j be the Grinch that stole Christmas, right?
Yeah, who knows what's going to happen Friday.
I don't see any new questions coming in, George or Roland. Why don't we go through our wrap up? And before you guys get, thank you so much, folks. And George and Roland, back to you for a wrap up. Okay, there's actually one question came through. Aha, what should senior management do to prevent a similar situation from happening again?
Yeah, so I'll take that since, obviously, I'm part of the executive team at Sumo Logic with board visibility, it's really starting to take a maniacal look at yourself and where you can improve. A lot of times senior management just doesn't want to deal with these types of situations or put skeletons in the closet. And especially from a security perspective, when I was coming up in this industry, you saw security people coming and you ran. They always said no to everything. They were always blockers of everything. And so I think to flip this a little bit, security folks also need to start being a little bit more approachable, encourage mistakes, encourage self-reporting, work closer with the business to where it isn't always selling insurance. And that way they get involved more in the strategy of what's taking place and get more of that voice. Once they have that voice, it's up to senior management and executives to really take a hard look at themselves and invest more in cybersecurity. I mean, it's just always been one of these things. Again, I'm gonna go back to SolarWinds. Like I said, I had friends there. And a lot of these folks wanted to do the right things for a long time. They knew something like this could potentially happen to them, but they weren't getting the proper funding. They weren't getting the right amount of attention that they needed. And then lo and behold, every time people get budget and security is when an event takes place. And so balance it out, balance out how much that you invest in a continuing maturing cybersecurity program over time. And so I just absolutely love this question, Wendy, that you put in here, because it really does start and end with a top-down approach. Management's got to set the example. The other thing I'll say as well too is in the way that senior management behaves. I used to work for companies back in the day to where there'd be a policy that was put out there and executives were like, that doesn't apply to me. I don't need MFA. I'm just going to go ahead and log in. Why am I forced to change my password every 30 days or whatever it may be? It starts with you. And when you do the right things, when you have the right hygiene, when you set that example, then security becomes part of everyone's job and everyone starts paying attention to it that way. Roland, I'd love to get your thoughts around this as well too.
My recommendation is pretty easy, George. It's sit down with your, if you have compliance folks, sit down and take a nice hard look at the risk register. Take a look at your latest, if you have any certifications, attestations, take a look at those reports and you may see the beginnings of some failings if you have any. And that's a great way to hopefully prevent or mitigate some of the impact of something like this. And the last thing is talk to your security professionals. Just sit down and have a normal conversation. You're going to get more than what you ask for, but just have a conversation and then you can parse out what's important and what's not, but you'll definitely get an earful.
I don't see any more questions. Thanks, folks. Back to you, George and Roland, for wrap.
Yeah, if we could just go to the last slide. Look, if anyone thinks of anything later on, or you just sort of want to follow what's happening out there, there's my Twitter account. DM me on Twitter. We'd love to hear from you. But again, go to the response page that we posted out there. But there's a lot of other places you could have been this morning. And so thank you for being with us. We'll continue to do these as much as we possibly can and always look to learn from each other. Roland, Garish, any parting words?
Thank you.
Just thank you.
And good luck. All right, everyone. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.